millions of people in the West and Muslims and Western Muslims believe three things, and you talk about this in the book. Gaza is a concentration camp, Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians, and they believe that tens of thousands of children have been murdered by Israel over the last couple of years. Is there any accuracy to any of these 3 points? And how does one sort of persuade people who genuinely and sincerely believe that? Because I mean, you've probably interviewed them. I've interviewed people, left-wing people, radical Muslims, who are incredibly emotive and genuinely believe that Israel is committing some kind of genocide here.
The first thing is they should read my book, or any other book which is by somebody who's seen what I've seen, spoken to the number of people I've spoken to, survivors, families of hostages, people who witnessed Hamas's barbarism up close, been with the IDF during their operations in Gaza and Lebanon to try to fulfill the 2 aims of Israel's war, which are to return the kidnapped hostages, many of whom are still in captivity as we speak, and secondly, to destroy the leadership of Hamas and make Hamas effectively operationally incapable. To take just those 3 lies which you cite, anyone who knows what Gaza was like before October the 7th, 2023, it's a very different place now because of the choices that Hamas made. Anyone who knows anything about Gaza could tell quite a lot of tells of why Gaza in no way resembled a concentration camp, which is a deliberate smear which people use because they know that if you use the accusation concentration camp against the Jewish state, you will particularly wound and upset Jews. That's why they do it. That's why they don't say, it's a shame that, it's a shame that more food trucks can't come in, as it was, there's no shortage of food trucks, but that they can't come in without having to be searched because they have to be searched because of missiles, but we understand, or something like that. Gaza's population almost doubled from the time that every Jew was torn from their homes by the IDF in Gaza in 2005, and the whole territory given over to the Palestinian peoples, who then voted in Hamas. In the time from 2005, when every Jew was made to leave Gaza, because everybody seems to agree that one of the natural things for the Palestinians is they can't have a single Jew near them. That seems for some reason to be a completely acceptable opinion. From the time the withdrawal in 2005 to October the 7th, 2023, the population of Gaza almost doubled. Even the people who make the outrageous claims about Israel's military actions and military response to the 7th of October, they can't reconcile in their heads the lies they're saying. For instance, they will say that the population of Gaza is disproportionately young. That does happen to be true, but you'll notice that you have a choice between those 2 things, don't you? Either it's a concentration camp, or it's a place where the population doubles and people are able to have a lot of children. You will notice that there was no doubling of the population in Bergen-Belsen in the 1940s. So it's one of the many reasons why it's totally obscene. The other reason is, by the way, that anyone who knows anything about Gaza between 2005 and 2023, and again, I give many examples in the book, will know that actually, compared to the rest of the region, other Arab countries in the region, other Muslim countries in the region, Gaza was pretty much like, some of them actually living standards were higher in Gaza than some of their neighbors. They had shopping malls and swimming pools and leisure centers and marketplaces, and actually the strip along the beach was really a rather nice bit of town. Billions of dollars were poured into Gaza in international aid from other people in the region, by British taxpayers, American taxpayers, EU taxpayers, and others. Billions of dollars were not poured in to Auschwitz in the 1940s. It's like, this is just obscene. You'll notice that people were not driving luxury cars around Treblinka in the 90s. This is obscene. But as I say, people make that accusation because they want to wound the Jewish state. Concentration camp is a very good way to do that, by claiming that. Other 2 examples you give of disproportionately the death of children, certainly children will have been killed in fighting in Gaza, certainly. We cannot rely on the Hamas numbers which they give out, which are the only numbers that can be, which any of the Western media decide can actually be used. But the best analysts of the war from outside have said that in the whole history of warfare, it's highly unlikely there has been a war before where in such a dense area, which is completely booby-trapped, and much more by Hamas in the 18 years they ran Gaza, that in very very few, if not no occasions in the history of war has civilian casualty to terrorist death been so low that it is roughly one terrorist to one civilian dead. Now, if that means it's 15,000 Hamas terrorists killed, maybe that means there are 30,000 Palestinians killed. This is terrible, terrible. But this is a war that Hamas started, and they didn't have to start the war. And the accusation that Israel would be deliberately targeting children is another of the outrageous smears. The third one you gave, just remind me quickly, was...
The second one was genocide.
Genocide.
The third one was...
The genocide, again, genocide was what Hamas attempted on the 7th of October, when 4,000 of their terrorists, along with Islamic Jihad, broke into Israel, went into innocent people's homes and burned them alive in their homes, and went through the Nova music party of young people simply dancing in the early hours of the morning and raped and murdered their way through that party. That was an attempted genocide. By the way, Hezbollah were meant to do the same thing from the north, and thank goodness Hamas and Hezbollah weren't able to communicate. It's something I go into in the book. Weren't able to communicate to make sure that it was coordinated. If it had have been, exactly the same thing would have come from the north. As it was, Hezbollah didn't have the advance notice, and they just joined in with rocket fire from the air. But the genocide was what Hamas and their allies want to commit. Genocide is what their backers, the Iranian Revolutionary Government in Iran, say they want to carry out. If Israel had wanted to commit genocide in Gaza, I mean, first of all, they wouldn't. Secondly, they could have done if they'd have wanted to. If they just simply wanted to kill everyone in Gaza, the Israeli Air Force could have gone in on October the 8th and done that. There would not be currently hundreds and hundreds of dead Israeli soldiers, reservists and others of your age and younger, Israeli soldiers killed in the line of duty because they were going through Gaza so carefully. If they'd have wanted to commit genocide, Israel wouldn't have lost all of these young men and women. They lost them because of the rules of war that they follow, that Hamas absolutely not only refuses to follow, but uses against them. But the interesting thing about all of these allegations is this. I say at one point in the book, there's a very, very interesting line that I borrow from a great Soviet writer, Vasily Grossman, which is, tell me what you accuse the Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of. This held true, as Grossman says in the 1950s, held true for anti-Semites throughout history. And by the way, of course, I have to add the caveat, but it's true, not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. But when you hold Israel to double standards and different standards than you would hold any other country to, then yes, that's anti-Semitism. But Grossman's line, tell me what you accuse the Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of, absolutely characterizes all of these things. The Hamas supporters in Britain and elsewhere support a movement that wanted to commit genocide, so they accuse the Israelis of genocide. They support people who slaughtered children in their homes on the 7th of October without mercy, with glee, with delight, so they accuse Israel of wanting to kill children. They want a concentration camp for the Jews. They want the annihilation of the Jews. They love the idea of the annihilation of the Jews. So they accuse the Jews of setting up a concentration camp. This rule holds absolutely consistently. What are the other things they accuse of? Just look the other month, there are a bunch of weird left-wingers in Britain and elsewhere who started sending out this slurry of stories online claiming that the Israeli defense forces in Gaza had been raping women in the Shifa hospital, I think it was Hamas command headquarters. And they say, aha, the IDF are rapists. You have spent the last 18 months supporting rapists. You spent the last 18 months denying rapes or glorifying rapes or supporting the people who carry out rapes, who GoPro their abuse of women on October the 7th, who record it, who broadcast it, who are proud of it. You support those people for 18 months and then you accuse the Israelis of raping? Every single time this rule holds. And the people who have been making these totally false allegations against the Israelis since October the 7th, And where they didn't on the 7th, and many did, they started on the 8th of October. Every time they have told us about themselves, the people who have marched through London week after week, who don't give a darn about anything else other than Jews never winning, those people make lurid accusation after lurid accusation against the world's one Jewish state because they accuse it of things that they themselves like and want.
You quote Vasily Grossman throughout the book, obviously an incredible writer who documented some of the worst crimes of the 20th century, which was a truly bloody, terrible century. You write in the book, you saw protests around the world just after October 7th, immediately supporting what Hamas did, which is shocking.
The first ones in London were on the evening of the 7th.
Yeah. While the actual atrocities were still...
On the evening of the 7th, certain British left-wingers and Muslims couldn't resist going straight out onto the streets to celebrate, and we have much documentary evidence of it. And then on the 8th, they really got organised. And in Britain, they asked for their permits to protest against Israel. They asked for the permits on the 7th as the massacre was going on, and they turned out on the streets on the 8th as the massacres were still going on. These are sick people we have in our midst.
So you say in the book, everywhere the same thought came to my mind. What has it got to do with you? Now, I want to put that question to you as well. I mean, having read the book, I think I know the answer. But why have you sort of become so obsessed with this issue? What sparked the interest with you?
What you call my obsession with the issue.
I'm not saying it's a bad thing.
No. I'm deeply engrossed in the issue and committed to it for several reasons. One is that as a journalist, I've seen a lot of this up close, and I can't bear the lies. And that's been the case for some 20 years now on this conflict. I was in Israel during the 2006 Lebanon war, Hezbollah war, and saw then for the first time myself the unbelievably skewed nature of reporting on, for instance, the BBC about this conflict, where Hezbollah would fire rockets in towns I was in the north of Israel. And then you'd look at the BBC News the next day and it would have, Israelis bomb Lebanon, as if they'd just done it for no reason and the initial thing hadn't happened. So there's that. I think in terms of just honesty in reporting, honesty in understanding the situation, it gets under my skin because I don't think any country, not even Britain or America these days, is as lied about and as libeled as the state of Israel is. Not even the American armed forces or the British armed forces are lied about as much as the Israeli armed forces. And I think that this is something which should get under the skin of anyone who reports on this. But I think the thing underneath your question is, yes, I mean, when I wasn't in the Middle East in the last couple of years, or when I returned from there to Canada, America, Australia, Britain, France, almost everywhere there were these protests against Israel. And I remember in snowy Ottawa one day, there were these anti-Israel protesters. And I think, but I mean, you're in Ottawa. What's it got to do with you? Or in Melbourne or Sydney. You're on the other end of the world. You guys didn't turn out when hundreds of thousands of people were being killed in Yemen, far more than have been killed in Gaza. You weren't out on the streets week after week during the Syrian civil war, or you're not on the streets now for the actual genocide going on in Sudan. Why this one? Well, my belief is, and I say this in the book, that I think that the jihadists and the Hamas lovers and the death cult worshippers, I think they have deliberately put their finger on something, whether they know it or not, which is that their belief, as stated by people like the Columbia students protesters, their belief is that you should destroy Israel first and all of the rest of the West next. And they see the destruction of the world's one Jewish state as being achievable more easily than the destruction of the United States of America where we're sitting or the United Kingdom where we're from. They see the eradication of the one Jewish state as being the nearest achievable goal and the overthrow of all other Western societies as the next step. Why do they think that? Why do they believe that? Why are they so het up about it? It's animated by a form of anti-Semitism which most Westerners don't understand, and why would they, which is Islamic anti-Semitism, which is its own strain, separate, I think, from Christian anti-Semitism and separate from left-right fascist communist anti-Semitisms that have existed in the past. Islamic anti-Semitism has its own driver. It is, to quote somebody I don't often quote, to quote Mehdi Hassan, somebody who used to be a journalist from the UK, said some years ago in a left-wing magazine, The New Statesman, that Muslim anti-Semitism is, quote, rife, routine, and commonplace among British Muslims. Mehdi Hassan's words, not mine, routine and commonplace. Why are British Muslims so animated about Israel? The Jews were among the first people to reject the revelation of Muhammad. They have shown that you can create a booming and successful state surrounded by Muslim states, which are, to say the least, not places that you, I, or any other Westerner would love to live. You might say Dubai at times, but frankly, all these places are on some kind of borrowed time or slightly weird enclaves. And in the end, it comes down, that form of anti-Semitism, that form of anti-Israelism, comes down to a desire to cut Western civilization at its root. Western civilization is, as everybody should know or does know, a combination of the inheritance of the Bible and of the ancient Greek and Roman worlds, of Athens and Jerusalem. If you want to destroy Western civilization, to take out Jerusalem is to cut our civilization at the root. It is to completely destroy the tree that has given our civilization life. So in some ways, they have chosen their target well. And I believe that if you don't want to see that happen, if you don't want to see the complete eradication of Western civilization, then no, you don't have to support absolutely everything the State of Israel does. You don't have to understand everything about it, but you should understand what the radicals today are trying to do. They are trying to upend the whole civilization, starting with the one Jewish state. And there's a rule that I have about this, which I hope people might recognize as something they might have seen with their own eyes. When there is, because it was one of the things that first alerted me to this pattern, when there is an anti-Israel protest in London, Birmingham, anywhere else in the UK, just as in New York or else, but you will notice in the UK when there is an anti-Israel protest, there is never a British flag. There will be Palestinian flags. There may be Hamas flags or Hezbollah flags or flags of other jihadist terrorist organizations. You'll never see a British flag. You'll notice that whenever they finish, they do not sing God Save the King. You'll notice that on the few occasions there have been pro-Israel protests in London in solidarity with Israel after October the 7th and the massacre of 1,200 people and the kidnapping of 250 more. You will notice that whenever there has been a pro-Israel protest, there will be British flags and Israeli flags. It will finish with the singing of the Israeli national anthem and the singing of God Save the King. You are in America and you see anti-Israel protests. There will never be the Stars and Stripes flying there, and they will never be singing the Star-Spangled Banner. In fact, in Washington, D.C., a little while ago when I was there and there was an anti-Israel protest, protesters located the American flags they could at the tops of the flagpoles in Washington, D.C., and burnt them on the floor of the American Capitol. They are telling us something very clear. It's Israel first, but all of you next. And I think we should believe them and recognize them. So those people want Israel to lose, and they want Hamas to win. I want Israel to win, and I want Hamas and all of their backers to lose. Fine. We disagree, and we'll see who wins.
One of the main differences I've noticed moving from London to Washington is on the right, there's a lot more skepticism of Israel in the United States than there is in Britain that I've seen. Now, that may not be mainstream in the US, but there's a lot of people, at least online on the right, who are much more skeptical of Israel, and just people working in DC, working in the Senate, working in the House. I've met lots of staffers who are more skeptical, who, by the way, I don't think are necessarily anti-Semitic. I'm just saying more skeptical. And they would question your idea of this sort of Israel being connected with Christianity. So this Judeo-Christian phrase, for example, and that Israel is very important to America. And perhaps one of the things they may cite recently was that Israel, and this is just one example, the official Israel X account posted on Twitter after the Pope died, "Rest in peace, Pope Francis, may his memory be a blessing," alongside a picture of the Pope visiting the Western Wall in Jerusalem. That was then deleted, and according to the Jerusalem Post, officials at the Foreign Ministry suggested that this was because the Pope had made statements against Israel. What do you make of that? Do you think that that's slightly insulting?
That's just twittering. I mean, I don't think that's of any significance. I mean, I'm interested in the deeper thing. I'm interested in what is real, not in what a couple of people notice on Twitter. I mean, usually in my experience, when somebody cites something like that, it's because they are kind of lazy and think that some kind of Twitter fad is the real world.
Well, perhaps the more real argument might be, for example, over Easter, Israel, and I think for perfectly reasonable reasons, limited the amount of Palestinian Christians that were able to go into the holy capital in Jerusalem.
There's always vast numbers of people in Jerusalem over Easter. I've been there myself. I think you may have listened to some very ill-informed staffers. The holy places are certainly better preserved now than at most times throughout history. Christians in Israel and in Jerusalem have worship at the Holy Sepulchre. The main problem for Christians at the Holy Sepulchre on Easter is other Christians, because usually what happens is that the Palestinian Muslims who have the keys to the Holy Sepulchre have usually Jewish army and other guards there to stop the Christians from killing each other. Because, have you been to the Holy Sepulchre? Right. Well, every denomination in Christendom has a chapel, a bit of the church to itself. So a lot of Israeli troops at some point, or Israeli police have at some point in their career had to separate out warring Armenian Christians from having fights and literally sometimes punch-ups with Greek Orthodox Christians or Russian Orthodox Christians. Or it's an amazingly complicated melting pot of the world's faiths. But no, I mean, the idea that there's any anti-Christianism in Israel, they're deeply proud of their Christian populations. I cite Christians in the book who are proud Israelis who've been affected by events of recent years. No, I mean, I don't know. You've probably spoken to some of the wing in American politics that does exist, which believes that just America doesn't need any allies in the world and shouldn't be involved in the world. And so there is a ecosystem that basically misleads people about what the realities are on the ground there, gets things wrong, will claim things like Bethlehem has been cleared of Christians, and they don't realize that that's because the PA, the Palestinian Authority that's in charge of that part of the West Bank of Judea and Samaria, has very, very carefully, that this is Palestinian Muslims, has very carefully ethnically cleansed Bethlehem of Christians since they've had rule over that area. The people you're speaking to, I think, probably don't know any of these details, but I would guess that they are people who have what I regard as the unanswerable, unsolvable question of the isolationist American right, which is that they want America to be the world's dominant power, but they don't want any involvement in the world.
It's 2025. America's debt is over $37 trillion, and the dollar just had its worst crash since 1973. That puts your savings and your family's future at risk. That's why we trust Alpha Omega Gold, a company that stands unapologetically with Israel and supports Stand Tall Israel. Visit ao.gold/stand to claim your free precious metals wayfinder guide or call 1-855-426-4653 today. Protect your future before it's too late.